economic aspects. I suspect he might look further. And I'm going to just make one other little personal introductory comment. On the way here, I was listening to Eusebius McKaiser on 702 talking about feminism and having a debate on what feminism means, and they were talking about white feminism and black feminism, and someone said they're in favor of human feminism. And I was fascinated by how someone like him has very, very clear thoughts about social freedoms, gay marriage, women's rights, civil liberties, due process, justice. But when it comes to economics, he's just in another realm. All of a sudden, all of those principles go out the window. It's as if he lives in two worlds. And I know him personally, and I'm not talking behind his back. I've told him this myself, that when he's talking about economics, he wants everything controlled. He wants people controlled. He doesn't want people to be free to decide what transactions they enter into, whether to sell their labor, whether to run a tavern or a big bank or whatever. When it's about every other kind of freedom, it's very clear, very simple, very consistent. He's totally libertarian. Now, quite how that works, I don't personally know. I mean, I look at you and I just think, you should be free. I don't say when you're buying something as a consumer, you should be forced to buy a warranty, which is what our Consumer Protection Act. You should pay for it whether you want it or not. You may not buy anything footstoots anymore under our law. In other words, you are forced as a consumer to pay more. But when you're deciding who to marry or what religion to adopt or whatever, I want you to be free. Now, I just don't get how you can be that inconsistent. I personally don't relate to it. So Neil will talk to us about the economic realm, largely, but touch on law and the rule of law and so on. He is director and founder of Knightsbridge, which is a fascinating and very successful company in the tourism industry, does booking services mainly. He started his career as a foreign exchange trader in the London financial markets, by far the biggest and most important in the world. And then he left, and ever since then the London financial markets have been in decline. And he came to South Africa. Correlation isn't necessarily cause, as he will explain to us, but in this case it might well be. He started here writing financial software and ultimately founded his existing business with his wife Teresa, who we knew. We actually introduced her to him, or him to her, and the rest was history. In 2003, Emerick, Neil, this is Emerick, he developed the software tool that is freely available on the internet. Anyone can download it. With all the data he's going to show you is in the software, and he will be using and demonstrating the software. He produced it, and every year the Economic Freedom Index is produced internationally by over 100 foundations and institutes like ours, or institutes representing over 100 countries. And it goes out with the software he wrote. He's produced the software whereby anybody in this room, very easy to use. I always say that having Neil's software is like an adult having a toy train. You can really play nice games of work out, what the correlation is between, I don't know, the number of nuns in Outer Mongolia and the GDP or whatever it might be. He had a BCom degree and is currently studying an LLB at UNISA. And he lives in the sovereign independent Republic of Hout Bay, which is on the southern tip of Africa. Some people think it's part of South Africa. So with that, over to Neil to tell us about this year's Economic Freedom of the World Index. And I'm sad to say some very bad news in it for South Africa. With what he's going to tell us, you will understand why our economy is stagnating and is extremely unlikely to start growing, at least not on any enduring basis. Over to you.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Leon. And welcome, everybody, to this year's Economic Freedom of the World Report launch. As Leon says, my involvement has been with the Free Market Foundation as an associate for getting on 17 years now. And I have Leon and Eustace to thank for introducing me to my wife. I think I also remember sort of still the youngest junior member of staff here. I think it's still doing great work over the years. South Africa has a peculiar definition of economic freedom, as illustrated by this fella. It's interesting, Bob Lawson, the author of the index, he has some Google alerts where he watches out for the words economic freedom. Obviously that's something he's been following very closely for the last 20 years. And unfortunately his inbox is now filled up with noise from South Africa. So this is ruining his Google alert. He's yet to figure out a filter to understand the economic freedom that he's talking about and the one that's being espoused by this gentleman. So we want to first begin this sort of talk with an explanation of what we define economic freedom to be. I can tell you we're not going to talk about political freedoms. It's not that. We are measuring a very specific thing, which is economic freedom, and you'll see how that's broken down. I'm going to show you some of the explanation of the report's components, and then we'll obviously show you the results from this year, and then I'll introduce you to a little bit of the software where you can play around with this stuff yourself and see how it all works. We are also celebrating the 30th anniversary of the report this year. It was in 1996 at a Mont Pelerin meeting where various economists, including Milton Friedman, had gathered, and they were engaged in the left-right economic debate, arguing how their ideas might be put forward and become convincing to convince the politicians, to convince other people. And of course, it just becomes a pub debate where the left and the right fight it out. And Milton was very keen to try and find a way of expressing their ideas in a very objective manner. And discussions began, thank you, Leon, discussions began about how they might objectively measure what they defined as economic freedom. The first thing to do was to sort of look at the major tenets of what the libertarians would define as free markets, as economic freedom, which would be private property, the rule of law protecting that private property, free trade, especially with foreign countries, sound money, and a limited role for government in the economy. So on that basis, they looked to create an index that would measure each of those elements and combine them into a single number that we could then use for academic work, which we'll see now. Michael Walker is the sort of major proponent and publisher of the report. That's the Fraser Institute in Vancouver. They are actually the authors of the production of the report, whereas the data itself comes from Robert Lawson and James Gwatney. Bob Lawson has become a fan of South Africa now. He came here a couple of years ago and stayed with us in Cape Town, spent some time here. His daughter actually attended UCT for a semester this year and enjoyed the fees must fall campaigns and all the other nice, interesting debates that went on at UCT this year. So he's been quite following our country from two aspects. Now, this particular report, one of its key goals is to try and be as objective as possible. If the goal is to avoid the ideological debate, then one must try to use data that is not contestable by the oppositions. So this is a report of reports. We get the data from other reputed international reports such as the World Bank Development Indicators, the International Monetary Fund, the World Economic Forum, Global Competitiveness Report, and things like the International Country Risk Guide. So if you have any dispute with the numbers themselves, you can go to those original sources and check where those data come from and how they were comprised. Our report is then a conglomeration of all those different numbers themselves. And I think the importance of an index as an instrument is that it's a useful tool that can be used to add real evidence to the debate. We can argue the left and right position for centuries, but we hope that this artifact is useful in scholarly work to actually sit down and say, given these set of policies, these are the economic outcomes that you should expect. And I think the index over 30 years is making a very meaningful contribution in that area. It allows researchers to try and identify causality. We're going to show you lots of charts where we might show correlation, but there is a lot of work that's going on to try to prove how, over the period of time, countries that have pursued economic freedom policies have altered their destiny and received better outcomes as a consequence. And although it's very much a scholarly work, I think events like this, the press we've had this morning, countries are always very interested, and the press are always very interested in rankings. It's like our league table, like football scores, and it does get a lot of press. It gets a lot of interest around the world. And I think, you know, governments do have an eye on it, and perhaps our own government not so much, but I know in some other countries they keep a very close eye on their rankings and guard it very jealously where they score well. So the report itself is used in a particular genre of economics, particularly in the area of economic growth, where the macroeconomists are looking to study 4 reasons for growth. There's been many, many theories in the past 100 years, things like distance from markets, length of coastlines, industrial development, and so on. This particular report makes a contribution in the area of institutional economics. So this is arguing that it's your institutions that matter. If you get the rule of law right and other institutions right, then your economy is in a position to grow. And I think the index has done very well in that regard. In terms of its academic results, we've had over 402 articles now cite the index, nearly half of which have used the index as an independent variable. So where these guys are using economic variable on the x-axis, there'll be something that they're plotting on the y-axis, and they'll be analysing all manner of variables. We've seen reports that look at the correlation between economic freedom and the likelihood of civil war within a country, gender equality, movement across borders between 2 countries with different economic freedom scores. Lots and lots of reports, some of which can be very dry. It is a tool for the econometrician, but I think they're very, very important results. And less than 4% found that the economic freedom indicator correlated with a bad outcome. So the scholars would agree that this is a very important thing to pursue. I'm going to move on now to the actual components of the index. There are 5 major categories. We look at the size of government, the legal system and property rights, sound money, which is inflation, freedom to trade internationally, and regulation of credit, labour and business. I won't go through all of these, but I just want to give you a sense, a flavour of what subcategories there are within the bigger categories. This one is an important one, I think, for South Africa. We're looking at general government consumption spending. That's a number we can easily draw from the fiscus. So it's how much, or at what percentage of our economy, GDP, does the government spend relative to the private sector. In this country, we're around the 30% mark. Then we have our transfers and subsidies, which is our social welfare system, and the high taxes across the economy. And Area 1C is our state-owned enterprises. So that's our Escoms and our Transnets and PetroSAs, and to what degree any government has an interest in running businesses within the economy. Area 2 is the legal institutions. South Africa does relatively well here. It looks at impartial courts, protection of property rights. Unfortunately, we had reliability of the police and the business costs of crime added a couple of years back, and that gave us a bit of a hit in these categories. But generally speaking, we still have very respected courts, and they are judged as with integrity, and we score very, very well in this category. Sound money looks at inflation. We're looking at both the growth of the money supply, the deviation of the inflation rate, how volatile it is, and the absolute level of inflation. We have quite a high band that the central government sets of 3 to 6%. This is a very high band internationally. And we look at the freedom to own foreign currency bank accounts. If your government is corrupting your money, what opportunity do you have to keep your savings in a different currency? If you have that opportunity, it's a safety valve. Your freedom to trade with foreigners can be measured in many, many different ways. Here we look at tariffs, and we also look at the deviation in tariffs. So it might be that a country puts a 10% tariff across the board. In South Africa, what we find is we have a very high deviation. We might have a 2% tax here, and we have a 40% tax there, and it looks very much like institutional lobbying has worked because the government has cherry-picked which industries it wishes to protect and which it wants to save. And the variation on our tariffs is quite high. We look at other capital controls, work visas, how easy do we find it to bring skilled people into work or unskilled people to work, and are we allowed to take our money out, make investments elsewhere? And finally, there's the regulation section. Not an area we do well in. There's the credit market, which has been highly regulated in the last 5 years with the National Credit Act. Ownership of banks, we do reasonably well. Our banks are privately owned for the most part. We do have negative real interest rates if you think that inflation is around 6-7% at the moment. And then, of course, there's our labour rules. hiring and firing, centralized collective bargaining, minimum wage, regulated hours, and then general business regulation, red tape, which would be things like how difficult it is to start a business, whether you need licenses to start that business, environmental studies, all of these sort of various red tape and the cost of maintaining that compliance going on. All of those are measured, incorporated as a number on a scale of 1 to 10 and feed up to the top number. So we've defined what economic freedom is. Why do we think this is important? Well, I think we know we have very high levels of unemployment in this country. We have very, very high levels of poverty, inequality, and if we look at some of our public services like healthcare and education, we either don't have the money or we're not applying it correctly or we're just letting the wrong people do the job. So these are some of the correlations that the Economic Freedom Index has been used, and we're comparing it against some of the outcomes that we assume we would want. So here we've taken the 159 countries and split them into 4 quartiles, and this is the average salary per year of somebody in that quartile. So the least free economic set of countries, you're likely to earn an average income of $5,000 a year, and the most free earn up to $41,000 a year. This is quite a stark number, and one is often criticized as saying, well, is this correlation or causation, which way round is it? I'll go to my next graph and see if this makes things clearer. But here we have the growth numbers. So the least free economic countries only grow at about 1.5% on average. The most economically free grow at 3.6%. Now, I find it more difficult to assume that the correlation or the causation is the other way around on this graph. I don't see how, if you are more free, if you have stronger economic growth, why you'd suddenly have more economic freedom. I think it's entirely more likely that if you have more economic freedom, that this causes higher levels of economic growth. You are also likely to live longer if you live in a free country. So you will have likely die at age 64 in the least free countries, and you can expect to live to 80 in an economically free country. Obviously, that's correlated with income, which is correlated with healthcare costs, but I still think it's an important number. And I think this is one of the most powerful slides that we're able to offer. This is the income share of the poorest 10% in any quartile. So in the least free countries, the bottom 10% in that group will only earn about $1,000 a year, whereas the poorest 10% in the most free countries can earn up to $11,200 a year on average. So this is why you see boats going in one direction, from Cuba to America, because the poor know where they are better off, and that is in the economically free countries. If you're going to be poor in an economically free country. I think one of the other obvious criticisms of capitalism is that it is accused of creating further inequalities across the various income level groups. This graph attempts to contradict that. It is the income percentage that the poorest 10% take from the economy, and what you can see is that it's pretty flat. Pretty much 2.5% is what the poorest 10% get in any country. So the message here is that income inequality is not really defined by economic freedom. You can have high levels of income inequality in both socialist and capitalist countries. There are different factors at play here. Economic freedom doesn't seem to be the important variable that would determine whether you are an unequal society or not. Something else is at play. And so we come to the results for 2016. I see you all there with your hands on the chairs, ready for the results. And I'm very disappointed to have to say that South Africa has dropped another 12 places in the index this year, one of our biggest drops, and we are now ranked 105th out of 159 countries. That puts us now at the bottom of the third quartile. So you can see where we are on all those graphs. We are now the one at the bottom of that second one in. This is our history for the last 40 years on the index, starting from 1970. We were a very open and free economy during the 70s for certain sections of the population, obviously not for others. But we can look at the 1990-95 period to 2000. say the Mandela period, where we sort of were around 40, a very moderate, open, free economy. And since 99, we've been on a downward spiral, becoming more and more regulated, more and more closed as an economy. And we have gone off a precipitous cliff in the last 5 years there, down to 105 today. This is a slide I put in 2 years ago, and I've updated it now. This is perhaps how an international macroeconomic investor might look at our country and say, well, how does South Africa compare? Who are its peers? And a couple of years back, it was Egypt and Kenya, and unfortunately, we've slipped further now, and we have a less free economy than Papua New Guinea or Serbia or Russia, Azerbaijan, and probably, Madagascar and Tunisia, not great examples of open markets. So this is our peer group now, and this is where we sit internationally. Our top 10, our shining stars in the index, our top 2 are the same again and have been since the beginning, Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, Canada, Mauritius, the only African company in the top 10, United Arab Emirates, several of the Arab countries doing very, very well, and the index moving up, UAE doing particularly well. Georgia, I'm going to talk about a bit more later, and Ireland, and Australia and the UK coming in at ranked 2. Interestingly, 5 countries, they're all ranked joint 5th. They're all on the same score, exactly. In the bottom 10, I think this is where the index passes the sniff test. You can see countries like Iran, Algeria, Chad, the Central African Republic, Argentina, which has slid a lot in the last few years, Republic of Congo, Libya, included a couple of years back in the index, and Venezuela, which we've tracked and reported on in this forum for the last 5 years, where the EFW index picked up that Venezuela was dropping quickly. And I think we're now seeing the results of those policies. Some of the other major countries, just for your interest, France is now at 57, Germany at 30, Greece is at 86. I think we can see there some of the Mediterranean and European countries have dropped quite a lot in the last 10 years. I think perhaps a function of the crisis, but a lot of them have implemented policies that regulate their banks, closed off their economies somewhat. It's not a story that's necessarily happening across Asia, certain parts of South America, but certainly Europe has become a lot more closed in the last 9 years. United Kingdom, though, is still there at 10. The land of the unfree is now down at 16. That's a number that's upsetting them greatly. UAE is in at 5, and then I include the BRICS countries there, just for a reference. These, again, are our peers, or we like to think that we're a member of this set, and the Economic Freedom Index shows that we are very much amongst our peers there. 124 for Brazil, 102 for Russia, China, 113. All guys in the bottom third quartile. What should give this institute hope is, I think, the mean score for the world as a whole. This slide I like. It shows that globalization is continuing. As a whole, we've gone up again this year, and I think that's a very, very healthy trend. The markets of the world are opening up to each other, and the world is getting richer. We also see that story played out across Africa, and going from the what did the economist call it? The dismal continent to Africa rising. And that is being picked up on the index. Rwanda especially has done exceptionally well. They're now at 49. They were sort of 80, 90 a couple of years back. A lot of interesting things happening in that country. Some of the other countries are coming off a very low base. So Malawi 4.95 to 5.79, but they are fixing things. And they are all going in the right direction. And several of these countries are now above South Africa in the index. So we watch them very carefully, and we watch where the investment money goes. This slide shows some of the policies where South Africa does well. We have private ownership of banks, not something that all the countries have. We do very well with impartial courts, judicial independence. I think we've seen that played out in the last 24 months with the public protector, some of the very important constitutional challenges that have been made. I think we've all got a lot of hope and trust, confidence in our court systems. And the index has picked that up. We're doing very well there. But these are the areas where we are worst in the index. Literally in the bottom 20 of the countries for hiring and firing, the business costs of crime, centralized collective bargaining. The argument is made that our labour laws are tough. Our local unions deny this, but the index is showing very clearly that we have some of the toughest labour laws in the world. And if we're going to make any changes or a dent in unemployment, at some point we're going to have to look at these laws. Standard deviation of tariffs is an interesting one, but this is where we seem to have picked our cherries or picked our industry winners in our import-export markets. And again, perhaps a more liberal regime of tariffs would help us get an improved score and help improve our prices for consumers. So the policy areas where South Africa has to work hard are across the board. In the 5 categories I've mentioned earlier, South Africa has done worse in every single one of them this year. So there's not one thing to fix. And I'm not sure that if we even fix one thing, it's going to help. We're going to need a major change in thought, a major ideological change in our governing party if we're going to turn some of these things around. We have a criminal level of unemployment, and yet we have the highest labour laws, and we're also discussing a national minimum wage, which is crazy. We also have very high level of state-owned enterprises. This slide is every PowerPoint presentation's anathema, because I've got tiny, tiny writing there and you can't read anything, and that's my point. This is how many state-owned enterprises there are. The government is involved in transport, telecommunications, healthcare, education, petrochemicals, theatre, airlines. You know, these are all things that the private sector does perfectly well and the government does not need to do. And yet there are very large corporations here that are doing these things and losing very, very large amounts of money, which could be better spent elsewhere. So I mentioned earlier there, that we are currently in discussions with a national minimum wage, and it really does not seem the right time to be discussing this given our levels of unemployment and given our already heinous ranking in the Economic Freedom Index. To be discussing this at all is just an outrage. My contribution to this project has been the software version. I am a software geek, and when I had the reports that were given out each year, they were something like an inch thick. I decided that was a completely unreadable document, and it was going to be a lot more fun if we put all that data in a database and a tool that you could play with. The idea is that you can call up a sort of a spreadsheet type view of the different countries and the different statistics that are in the database. You can pick different countries, or you can group countries. You might want to have a look at the G7 or the G20 or middle-income countries. You bring that in with various time periods. You might want to look over 10 years or the last 5 years. You pick the statistics that you're interested in correlating, and you end up with a tabulated result, which you can then have a look at, sort and rank, and maybe you want to export to Excel and stick it in a graph and stick it in the press. What I also did was I took the World Bank Development Indicators. It's 5.5 million points of data from 1960 across 1,400 variables. A lot of data, 210 countries, I think. All that data is in the software as well. And the idea is that you can pull in the economic freedom number, and then you can pull in a number from the World Bank and see if they correlate. So you can do your own graphs where you lump countries together and you put the index down the one side and you graph the number on the other side against economic growth, longevity, gender equality, all the different things that the World Bank tracks. You can have fun with and plot those numbers and see the data for yourself. The original version of this software was written in Windows 15 years ago. We've been releasing a copy of it every year since then. But 2 years ago, we released a cloud-based version. We're keeping up the technology with modern technology. And you can now run this on your Mac and your iPad. So this is nice. If you have an internet connection, you can go straight to a URL, and the data is there for you to play with. And you can answer any of those questions in the bar while you're having your ideological debates. So that's the URL you can go to. It's EFW Data, Economic Freedom of the World, data.com. All you have to do is type in your email address, and it will email you your personal web link, and then you can just go straight into that database. At the top right is a link to the Windows version of the software. You can download that one. It's about 200 megs. It's got all the World Bank Development Indicators in. So does this one, the cloud-based one. But if you want to play with that data while you're on the aeroplane and you don't have an internet connection, then you're going to have to use the Windows version. I'm going to end the talk with a couple of quotes from Shining Light Libertarians. This one's from Gordon Tullock, where he said, "Self-interest is omnipresent, competition is omnipresent, but the way self-interest and competition manifest themselves is institutionally contingent. I think this is very, very important, and it's what the index is all about. The institutions matter. If we don't get the institutions right, the economy will not grow. And I think this recognised the fact that we have the underlying human motivations are true for socialism and capitalism, but how you build your institutions around those depends on sets the result. And then echoing the point that Leon made earlier, Milton Friedman said, for many of us, freedom, economic, political and civil, is an end in itself, not a means to other ends. It's what makes life worthwhile. We would prefer to live in a free country, even if it did not provide us and our fellow citizens with a higher standard of life than an alternative regime. Thankfully, as the Economic Freedom Index shows, open markets, free economies do produce the outcomes and results that we want. So we can have both economic freedom and all the good things that economic freedom brings. Thank you very much.
Questions, comments, just for those who are not from the media. This is meant to be a media event, so the press gets priority. But I guess there's a small enough group for everyone to have a go. Questions, comments, thoughts? Here we go.
Thanks. My name is Misha Cropper. I'm the president of the South African Labour Traders Association. I'm interested in the comments made on your opening remarks. You compared, I think the person that you showed us there is Julius Malema. And the other gentleman, I've got his name, I don't know if I had copy of your presentation. You're saying the economics, they are completely different. And they even mentioned that with economic freedom, we're not going to politicize into practice called total economic freedom. Maybe like to maybe explain to me how do they differ and how do you separate economic freedom from politics?
Okay, so I think there's two questions there. I actually don't think we differ from Julius's definition of economic freedom. I think we just turn the scale upside down. So where we would say economic freedom means open markets and everything, he wants closed markets for South Africa.
He wants open markets for Africa. That's on his manifesto. So I'm not quite sure how he wants to invest in the rest of Africa, but he wants to close South Africa off. There's a bit of a contradiction there. He wants the government to own the land. You know, we would say, well, we would want private citizens to own the land. So I don't think he actually differs from us on this is the scale that we are talking about. It's just that we say from 1 to 10 is this way, and he says from 1 to 10 is that way. Now, we would argue that if we all agree on the scale, does our version of the economics, or does our interpretation of the economics come to the results that we would want to? And I think, you know, he's simply misguided on the economic policies that he would follow. If he did, and if we went that route, we would end up with the same results as Venezuela, Brazil, Russia, Georgia. All of our experiments with socialism have ended with the same result. So I don't think we differ on the definition. I think we differ on the likely outcome. Can you distinguish between economic freedom and politics? No, I don't think you can. This is obviously a very political issue. It's something that's debated in the media all the time. We are lobbyists. We are advocates for free markets. This is a political exercise. What we hope is that we can take some of the politics out of it with an academic tool like this and let people have a look at some of the facts. Obviously, they will draw their own conclusions.
I just want to add an interesting little thing. In yesterday's papers was a photograph of Herman Mashaba, the new mayor of Johannesburg, handing out title deeds with the EFF city councillors supporting, agreeing, and actually gave a speech as well, saying that they agree with each other about property titling. Now that was interesting to me because in the EFF's manifesto it says all land should belong to the government. There should be no private land, no property titling. So I often wonder with them whether they, you know, how much of the rhetoric actually means anything, because if they can have a manifesto that says all land should belong to the government and yet be enthusiastic about issuing private land titles, I don't know. I'd love to ask, which are they? Are they for people owning their land or not? So I think the meaning of economic freedom is a bit obscure. Because, for example, they talk about removing red tape from small business, people like your members. And yet they say they want a controlled economy. So often, I suppose what's needed is some intelligent discussion about what these things mean.
I don't think you should ask them, you'll make them think, and that will be disastrous.
No, on the contrary, I think what's happening in the Joburg City Council is quite interesting and not a surprise to me. I think you'll find there's actually much more agreement than either them or Mashaba realized, but within the first few days they ended up agreeing on something and jointly presenting something. So it's going to be interesting. So I think you're wrong about that. That is, we're going to see some interesting developments.
Thanks. My name is Jason from Rensburg. I'm actually a consulting engineer. But what I was wondering with your statistical analysis that you have, is it possible to apply that historically, like to the Bolshevik Revolution or the French Revolution or the Habsburgs or whatever, where we knew there were disastrous failures, and at what stage did your statistics predict that? Or are we just looking at something and saying, you know, the way it's going, we're going to go off the edge, but is it going to happen in 6 months, 6 years, or 6 centuries? We don't know. My question is, can it, and have you done that application in the past and come to some sort of conclusion?
I think qualitative studies have been done, which are sort of historical reflections on, say, 5 or 6 countries. But this falls into the sort of quantitative analysis, and for that they have to go back to meaningful data. This goes back to 1970, but the data is even scant there. I think it's only about 100 countries that can produce data during that period. It really starts to kick in from the sort of 80s onwards,
and then we get a better sense of data. There's a specific kind of index within this one called the chain link index, which does the longitudinal analysis more carefully. It's a statistical artifact where the index each year has to incorporate variables from the previous year in order to be longitudinally accurate. Strictly speaking, the one that we publish each year, it can be looked at in its year, but not compared to previous years, because things do move around, other countries come in, some of the statistics change, and so on. So there have been many longitudinal studies since the 1970 period, but not before that. Behind you was the first one.
You mentioned you were going to start something about Georgia?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, 3 years ago, the Economic Freedom of the World launch was held in Georgia. I was lucky enough to go along. It's a fascinating country, well worth a visit to anybody just as a tourist. It's fabulous, easy to get to. You just fly directly to Turkey and then another hour in. It's an interesting country. During the 1990s, they had a horribly corrupt government. They'd just come out of the Soviet Socialist Republic. They had about a 10-year period with Edward Shevardnadze. They had corruption. They had a police force that was, getting bribes from its citizenry, very corrupt. And they had a president elected, a guy called Shevardnadze, Saakashvili, who I had the pleasure of meeting. And he took a libertarian hand to the economy in 12 years. He fired the entire police force, all the traffic cops, and then only hired back the best ones. They had no police force for about 3 weeks, and I think crime went down. They rebuilt the police stations out of glass as a symbolism of transparency, which is fascinating to this day if you go and see the police stations in Georgia. They invited South African farmers to come to teach them about farming. They opened the economy, they scrapped all tariffs, they privatized all the hospitals, and their economy's been growing at something like 10 to 13% in the last 12 years. Saakashvili lost his position as president 2 years ago, democratically. Unfortunately, he's been forced out of the country. But they seem to be continuing. I was very worried that the party that came in, which was a bit more left-orientated than he would turn the results that he'd attained around the other way, but it doesn't look like they have. They've continued with its policies, and I was thrilled to see Georgia's gone up into the top 10 this year. So that is a fascinating country. I wrote an article for it a couple of years ago, made comparisons to South Africa. Maybe we can put that article back up again just so people can find it. But I think there are some parallels with South Africa, and coming out of a very vicious system that didn't have a strong tradition of good courts and an open economy. The parallels there with South Africa are quite good. So I thought it was a good country, even though they're much smaller than us. I beg your pardon, yeah.
Can I just ask you, which way on the index are China and India going? Are they going down or going up?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can have a quick look. They've been stuck around the 120 mark for a long while. Yeah, this is how it works. So you can see a little bit of showing off here. Right, okay, so we want to get countries down the side. I'll call in, let's say, a 5-year thing. There we go. Let's call a couple of those years in. And we want to look at the total score. I'll quickly... Yeah, here we go. Told you I was a geek. All right, so we'll go down to China first, as you say. Oh, no, I went too far. China is there. Okay, so that, if you can't read it, it's they were 120th, they're now 113th, so statistically they haven't really moved. Brazil.
Sorry, just on China, when you say they haven't moved, there are now more countries, and they have gone up, so...
Yeah, some...
more of a move than this appears to suggest.
Yeah, it depends. I'm looking at the ranking. We can have a look at the score and see if the score changed. It is possible, of course, that other countries move faster on the elevator, and you drop your ranking because you're standing still. So Brazil, that's dropped. That's gone in the other direction. They've dropped from 100 to 124. India. Yeah, they've sort of bounced around that 111 mark. And then the other one in our BRICS group, Russia. We can compare Rwanda there. Look, so Russia was 100, 102, so they haven't really done or changed anything in the last 5 years. Rwanda there, 55 to 49, it's dipped a bit, it's jumped around there, hey? Can't make their minds up. And there's South Africa. Where are we? Why am I missing South Africa? Yeah, what's going on there? Oh, it's probably the... here we go, reorder the axis. Oh, we were at the top there, that's why. There we go. Yeah, so there we go. 5 years ago we were 87, and we're 105 today. That's the fun part. Weird definition of fun. Okay. I'm sure you can call on me for some other questions afterwards, but Leon, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Let's thank him in the appropriate manner. I think at least I appreciate the degree to which Neil is rigorously analytical and scholarly, but at the same time can communicate that in a coherent, digestible way. And I think that the evidence that's at our disposal settles the matter conclusively from an empirical point of view. In other words, which system works best? And that's really not debatable. There's no intellectual debate, no scholarly debate, no informed debate that can take place. It's a settled issue. The only reason you can be against economic freedom, as defined by this index, less control, is because you don't like people to be free. If you just think freedom is a bad idea, well, then you might not like what you see. But as Neil concluded in his concluding statement, that fortunately when you have more economic freedom, everything else is better as well. So not only are people free, but they live longer, and they have better healthcare, and they have better education, and they have better housing, and better everything, essentially. There's more data than is shown, that you can actually look at pretty much any published index in the world of the human or environmental condition, and the freer economies have a better score. Thanks to Neil for demonstrating that to us. Anyone who wants to, as he showed you, can get the data, the software, and play with the numbers yourself, and reach your own conclusions. And so there's no secrecy here. It's using completely independent, objective sources, and so nothing can be doctored. There's no cherry picking. He can't be accused, or the index can't be accused of bringing about the answer it wants. Anybody can do the same exercise with the software which he has made freely available to the world. Thank you for attending. There's some more snacks, I think, not many left. Tea, coffee, you had them all, and some conversation. Please hang around for chats and socializing. Thanks for coming. Thanks for